Hello, this is Mina Roberto,
And Jared Thompson.
and we are going to discuss the uses of microtransactions and loot boxes in video games. So, what are microtransactions? Well, they are a process for paying for virtual products using real world currency. Typically involves paying for a secondary currency that is used within a video game and obtain certain items. So, microtransactions started gaining popularity in the mid to late 2000s. They can actually be dated back to the early 1980s with arcade machines. Um, Arcade machines used to have a play until you die aspect to it, so players can spend hours upon hours playing the game off of 1 quarter if they were really good at the game. So they implemented a time limit into the arcade machines. So after every few minutes, the players would have to insert another quarter in order to progress through the game. And some problems with the microtransaction industry. Some companies prioritize making money over making a good game. To them, turning a profit will always be the reason for including microtransactions. In other instances, microtransactions are forced into games that do not need them. That is almost always for the sake of making an extra few dollars.
However, there are some positives to the microtransaction industry and how they work. For smaller video game studios, most notably mobile game developers, microtransactions are kind of a necessity when it comes to making a profit and keeping the company afloat, with the only other alternative really being advertisements. If handled properly, microtransactions that affect gameplay are actually useful when their effect is either minimal in regards to the actual gameplay or can also be obtained by non-paying users. And if cosmetics are the award for spending money, they are deemed a little more acceptable by the public under the same constraints. Now, one massive issue in the ethics side of things is whether loot boxes should be considered gambling, and if they should be, what developers should do about it. So, a massive topic that government agencies have been having recently are about whether loot boxes should be considered gambling, and if so, what should be done. Unfortunately, the concept of loot boxes has not aged long enough for a lot of research to be done on the topic. But the general consensus seems to be that preventing loot boxes from having an impact on gameplay seems to work out the best. Because when gameplay is directly influenced by loot boxes and the RNG system behind them, players are more likely to dislike that game. A very good case in point for this is Star Wars Battlefront 2. It was released by Electronic Arts, or EA as we will refer to them from now on, in 2017, and Battlefront 2 quickly became infamous for its loot box system. Essentially, a player's progression in the game's multiplayer department was entirely reliant on the randomness of loot boxes that were collected over the course of gameplay. Unfortunately, they did not come at a very high frequent rate, and when it was found that you could purchase them with actual money, it was easier for paying players to succeed in the game. And that ultimately caused a divide between paying and non-paying players. Now, before its release, the microtransaction system was actually removed from the game because of the amount of backlash EA faced. It was just simply massive. However, by the time they backtracked and removed the system temporarily, most gamers had made up their mind, and eventually the profit margins for the game kind of took a hit. Now, at that point, the loot box system was still completely random, and proper progression was way too luck-based. Simply put, players who put in hundreds of hours could be farther in their progression than players who had spent thousands of hours. Thankfully, in March of 2018, EA listened to consumers and actually removed the player progression from the loot boxes, instead placing them under gameplay lengths, playing certain hours with certain characters. This left the loot box system to be replaced almost exclusively for cosmetics. And because of how recent this change is, it's completely uncertain how this will ultimately affect sales or player viewpoint of the game.
So there is Overwatch as an example as well. It was released in May of 2016 by Blizzard, and it also has a loot box system only for cosmetics. Despite the system's existence since the game's launch, it is widely beloved, in counterpart to EA when they received their backlash for implementing the loot boxes. A Forbes article actually estimated that, based on public statements from Blizzard, that unlocking every single legendary cosmetic in a release anniversary event without in-game purchases would take about 267 hours of playtime. So there are a few ups and downs for Overwatch and their loot box system. It averages about 8 hours of playing a day. Although it is a large estimate, it also assumes that no duplicates appear in order to receive every single cosmetic. To some people, this number is not an issue. Dedicated players and collectors likely put in that much time already, so it's not that big a deal to them. So there's another issue, which is progression. Extending playtimes to sell more microtransactions brings up an ethics question. Should a video game be allowed to use microtransactions as an excuse to slow down a game's progression? Many gamers brush the argument aside, pointing out that free-to-play mobile games frequently rely on slow progression to give their game more value. However, others argue that giving that pass to mobile games is too generous. Regardless, this is a conversation worth having.
Now, our first example of a mobile game that uses a microtransaction system is a little game called Dungeon Keeper. Just like Battlefront 2, this was published by EA. If you've started to notice a trend, you are not alone. This was a remake of an old MS-DOS game that was basically built around the idea of building a dungeon. Now, carving out this dungeon requires a mechanic called imps. Imps build everything. They tear down walls, they put in traps, they do literally everything. But you are only given a limited amount of them. And if the imps are busy, nothing can be done until their work is either canceled or finished. This game uses a gem purchasing system to speed up the progress to buy more imps, though it does cap out at 6. Now, the wait times themselves start off very passive. They start off taking place between 1 to 30 minutes. So within the first hour of gameplay, there's not a lot going on. However, the wait times do increase very, very fast, to the point where they go from being a few minutes to being multiple hours long. At launch, some of these wait times were up to 24 hours. And although the game starts you with plenty of gems, the images to the right show that I started off with around 550, so the actual gem the gem output at the start is very nice. Obtaining more later on is very rare. So even though times go up to a full day and you have plenty of gems to work with, this is only a temporary. And because of these long wait times, the game is incentivizing the purchase of more gems to quicken the process. On the other end of this spectrum, you have a game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. This game was developed by Konami and is a game that emulates a famous card game in the real world of the same name. Like Dungeon Keeper, it also uses a gem-based system in order to purchase in-game booster packs. Now, these gems, unlike Dungeon Keeper, can be given away for virtually doing anything. Playing the game, tapping on random things on the screen. It's just a given. And the packs themselves come at a cost of about 50 gems per pack, with bundles of 10 being purchasable as well. There are also microtransactions in it, as you can see to the left, though the prices are a bit varied and considerably cheaper than what Dungeon Keeper offers. Despite the randomness of the pulls, everything in a set is always shown ahead of time, so you will always know what you are guaranteed to get. Now, the odds of a pack are very interesting in this case, with cards being listed in rarities of N, R, SR, and UR. Although a pack can have up to 2 different R cards. At any given point, they will only ever give you one SR or one UR. In larger boxes, out of 200 packs, you will pull about 34 URs and SRs, which estimates to about 1 out of 6 packs, whereas smaller boxes go for about 1 out of 8. And of course, the boxes can be reset at any point, so ultimately, obtaining any card is always possible. The image on the right is my first attempt at opening this pack, and you'll see that my results do match with those odds.
So, the current state of lawmaking in terms of these microtransactions and loot boxes, there haven't been much, but Hawaii and Belgium have started a discussion about them already. So, the House Bill 2686 and 2727, Senate Bill 3025 and 3026. The first of each would label loot box games as gambling, which would have a significant impact on age restrictions for games. The second of each would require game companies to list loot boxes as a feature on the game's cover. Neither bill relies on the other's success, so anything is possible. After the Battlefront fiasco, the Belgium Gaming Commission also began looking into loot boxes to decide if they should be considered gambling within the country. So, how would Canada be affected in all this? So far, Canada has not been too affected by these microtransaction problems. Most issues seem to be in the US currently, but the implications there could have an effect here as well. If the US passes any laws, similar laws are likely to be brought up in Canada. Passing something similar in the UN would guarantee changes in Canada. The impact of those laws are somewhat of a universal constant for the entire world.
This, of course, relates back to how the entire world is impacted. So at first, if loot boxes are treated as gambling, then naturally anyone who is below standard gambling age, mostly importantly children, would not be allowed to play any games that use that type of format. This, of course, would have a massive economic impact on any game that decides to use the loot box system. However, due to the digital format of many games nowadays, there are only really two ways that developers can implement these new laws to match their systems. They can either stop implementing loot boxes completely, which for larger companies would work out, because they already are making a lot of money from the games, they're already selling them for a high price. Their profit margins wouldn't necessarily get hit. However, smaller game studios, most notably mobile app developers, would take this pretty badly. However, the only other real alternative is trying to prevent kids from playing the games with loot boxes, which is virtually impossible because there's simply no way of properly policing that. Overall, regardless of what happens, that the industry as a whole would struggle.
All right, so my opinions on microtransactions and loot boxes is I'm not exactly for them if they affect gameplay. I don't think it's really fair to have people have an advantage over other players if they were able to buy something versus someone who wasn't able to buy it. Cosmetics, on the other hand, I can understand because they will never affect gameplay, and I'll never actually buy them personally.
As for my own opinions, they're very similar to Minna's, but they're a bit more mixed. At face value, I see a lot of microtransactions as being a solution to slow game progression, most notably in mobile apps. At first, anything that affects multiplayer or affects competitive play, if it involves microtransactions, I'm not very for it. However, I have spent money on something like Duel Links, so my statement there is a bit hypocritical, and I can understand that. However, I also understand the need for in-game purchases in games with free-to-play mechanics because I understand that, in a way, that is their only way of making income, and for cosmetics, I also agree that that is kind of an all-right situation. Now, that is ultimately the end of our presentation, but before we round up, we would like to give a sincere thank you to a friend of ours, Edward Heinrichs.
He was a former member of our group. Unfortunately, he had to drop the class because he got a career opportunity. He actually did help with more research and stuff with the essay as well.
He was incredibly helpful, and if it wasn't for his continued contribution, we likely wouldn't have been able to finish in time. So, from the bottom of our hearts, we thank you, Edward.
Yeah, thank you.
But that is all for our presentation. On screen now are just the few resources we had on hand. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. If you found this by pure chance and have no idea what's going on, we don't blame you for not knowing. But we hope you learned something from listening to our conversation.